Hey everyone, welcome back to the Them Before Us podcast. I'm your host, Jenn Friesen, and you are in the middle of one of our special podcast series, IVF, FYI, what happens if IVF becomes a right? Today we're talking about fraud, abuse, mistakes, the crazy things that happen in the reproductive technology industry when things go wrong, whether that's intentional or not. We're joined, as usual, by our engagement director, Patience Sunny. Hi, Patience. Thanks for being here.
Hey, it's great to be here.
And we're joined with a special guest, our founder and president, Katy Faust. Katy, thanks for being here.
Thank you for letting me join you, but mainly thank you to you both for driving this project, because there really isn't anything else like it in the United States or elsewhere, kind of shining a light on this dark underbelly that is present in the world of reproductive technologies that very few people know about. And even if they understand that there's some suspicious things taking place, this series is really going to allow us to see what exactly is going on and how is it victimizing kids. So this is a resource unlike anything else that you're going to find in the virtual world, or I'm not even aware of, like, in real life conversations or even books that have been written that are going to really examine all of the different areas where this industry is putting profits ahead of people.
Yeah, and it's been such an amazing journey just to be a part of the series as someone who's helping interview and feeling like we're learning a lot and talking to these experts. So we're hoping everybody who's listening really feels like it's a good resource that they are going to benefit from and that they can pass on to other folks. Them Before Us has heard stories and people have reached out to us who have been victims of the fertility industry in one way or another. And today we'll talk about fraud, where doctors have used their own sperm to create, 20 to 50 plus children, people not being told the truth about their origins and the things that can result from that. Or we'll talk about what happens when there's, quote, mistakes or accidents in the industry. But Katy, maybe just start us off by saying, why are we having you on versus, hey, we've got a guest who was a victim of fertility fraud. What's the difficulty with some of these topics?
It's the same difficulty that any child who has experienced a desire-based loss has to confront. And when I say desire-based loss, what I'm talking about is they lost their mother or father because some adult's desire was prioritized above their right to be known and loved by their mom and dad. So it is very, very hard to get any child who has a desire-based loss of their mother or father, desire-based family breakdown, as opposed to the death of a parent, for example, to then say, here is how my parents' choices harmed me. That is because there's so much at stake for these kids, right? They might lose a relationship with the only parent that they have left. They might jeopardize relationships with their siblings if they choose to go public about some of their pain. They might endure social scorn because they are running up against very politically expedient or acceptable narratives. Even when we catalog stories on our website, I regularly encourage people to use a pseudonym, because if they don't, they really have to hedge a lot of what they're going to say, because they're trying to preserve relationships or preserve their job or preserve, their friends or something like that. Finding people that will talk on camera under their own name and really share their stories is difficult because it is so high cost. So combine that cost with the fact that a lot of people that are victims of fertility fraud might not even know it yet, because sometimes you don't find out until later in life. Sometimes you don't find out unless you take a 23andMe test. And sometimes even then it takes a while to put the pieces together. It is very, very hard to find people who are going to be able to testify to the direct impact that these kinds of unethical practices are having in their life.
Yeah, that's good. Patience, to start us off, let's talk about a story that I think became featured in a big documentary, the story about
Mhm.
Dr. Cline.
Yeah, so Dr. Donald Cline was actually, his case was really what kind of drew attention to the reality of fertility fraud, and he was the subject of the Netflix documentary Our Fathers. So if that's something that our audience is familiar with, he's where that story came from. So what happened was one of one of the children that he created at his clinic was doing some DNA research. She took 23andMe. She knew that she was donor conceived, and she kept finding more and more half siblings, more than there should have been based on industry standards and regulations on how many children a sperm donor can create. And then eventually the DNA evidence led back towards Dr. Donald Cline, her mom's fertility doctor. This was someone that, their family had trusted. They've received treatment from him over the course of several years. And she found out based on her DNA that this was actually her father. And as she started communicating with her half siblings that she'd begun to locate via 23andMe and other online sources, um, eventually it came out that he fathered at least 94 children. And these half siblings, most of them were living within a 25-mile radius of each other. A lot of them expressed concern, as they were having kids, what if they accidentally date a cousin and they didn't know it? And so the daughter who initially discovered that Dr. Donald Cline was committing fertility fraud brought it to the state of Indiana, said, "Hey, this is going on." And initially, the case was dismissed because he lied to the state attorney general. And the only reason that he was ever charged with a felony was because he obstructed that investigation. Everything else just went through tort claims because there was no law on the books at the time preventing a fertility doctor from using his own sperm. And one of the things that's really troubling that gets highlighted in some of the stories that are told by Dr. Donald Cline's former patients and genetic children is that, to the best of their knowledge, he was simply going into the other room to retrieve his own sperm sample and coming back while still probably in a state of sexual arousal and inserting that sperm sample into his patients. And his patients have described it as this was medical assault by my doctor, by someone that I trusted, that my family trusted. And so he's the father of at least 94 children through that method. And that led to, yeah, it's astounding. And that led to a growing number of states saying, hey, maybe we should do something about this, especially when it became clear that the only reason that Dr. Donald Cline was charged with anything as severe as a felony was simply because he had lied to the state attorney general during the investigation. Currently, even after this story blew up and a few other stories about fertility fraud have come to light, only 14 states recognize fertility fraud as a crime. So, in other words, most states don't recognize it as a crime if a doctor inseminates a patient with his own sperm under false pretenses. Maybe you can sue for a tort, but you don't have a criminal case against that doctor if he does that and if you're the victim of that.
That's pretty crazy too, because at the very least, let's say you're pro everything, you think everything's fine. Aren't women at some level choosing the sperm they want from some sort of book, or there's like a little, it's like a Target, you get to put it in your cart or something, right? Like it's like a product you get to choose. So it's interesting that it's not even some sort of violation of
like consumer protection.
consumer protection. I signed up for this and
Yeah.
you gave me this. And it's interesting too. I mean, it's sort of that maybe it's an evolutionary argument that men want to propagate the species as much as possible, whatever these creeps are doing. I'm here to help women have children. Well, it's kind of like what we're seeing with some of these celebrities, right? It's like, hey, I'm just here to have as many kids as possible. I can financially provide for all of them, so it's fine. And this is just sort of a different version of the deadbeat dad who's creating 94 children that live in close proximity and don't know they're related. And I had never heard those particularly gross comments about the case either, but that's even just a whole nother level of his mindset is not, I'm trying to help women have kids, right? I read a note here too that he has paid out over $1 million in civil lawsuits. So they were able to find some sort of quote unquote justice, suing him civilly. But yeah, it's crazy. There weren't any of those laws on the books until now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yeah, like you said, normally people do have the opportunity to choose their sperm donor. And so there've even been stories of people who had a relationship with who they thought was their genetic dad. And then genetic testing revealed that actually their dad was the doctor and that the doctor had swapped out the sperm samples. And so, even when they thought they'd found that closure of, oh, I know who my dad is and I have a relationship with him now, then to suddenly have the rug pulled out from under them and discover that not only was their social father not their real dad, but also the person that they had been told was their genetic father was also not their real dad. And, as they pulled on more threads, it became obvious that their mom's fertility doctor was their dad, and that not only had they been lied to, but also their parents had been lied to.
Obviously, fertility fraud adds a new dimension of disturbing detail to what already is an industry that rampantly victimizes children. And we're going to go through a couple of those stories, but it's always interesting to me that if that is exactly what the women would have wanted, if the mothers were like, I actually would like to choose your sperm to implant, this wouldn't be a scandal at all. And yet for the child, they're still separated from a biological parent. They still have been commodified in some ways. Their father's still in some room. Maybe it wasn't the room directly adjacent to where the insemination was taking place, did still, commit an act that it is repugnant to a lot of these kids. And so again, like a lot of what we see in the world of reproductive technologies is if it offends the adults, that's the problem, not whether or not the children suffer as a result of the decisions of the adults. So to me, it just reinforces that this is an industry that functions as a marketplace to satisfy the adults. And many of these adults are perfectly happy separating a child from their biological parent. And that's exactly what they want. That's what they've paid for. That's fine. But if the child is separated from a biological parent and the commissioning adults are unhappy, that's when it's a problem. And obviously, the medical fraud just adds another sort of kind of power dynamic layer of disturbance to all of that.
Well, and it goes back to when we'll get into it, there's some things where, hey, there was a mistake. Now my biological child got messed up or switched in some way or whatever. And people will use that argumentation a lot to justify these technologies. Well, I have the right to have a child and be biologically connected to my child. And they cannot make the slightly longer leap that the child then has a right to biological connection to where he or she comes from. And to your point, Katie, they're intentionally doing that. They only get upset about it if the product gets messed up in some way.
Yeah.
Katie, tell us what another story that we have.
Well, there has been one victim of medical fertility fraud that has shared her story pretty openly on Instagram and in a couple of forums. Her name is Kat Quire. And this is very, very sad. I'm glad that she is going public, but she was raised by a sexual predator. So he was able to acquire possession of her and her sibling, conceived through sperm and egg donation, or conceived through sperm donation, right? So he didn't pretend to be her biological father, but he acquired these children through completely like legitimate means, according to the fertility industry. As always, children that go home with an unrelated commissioning adult are not going home to people that have undergone background checks and screening. So he was a predator and he sexually abused her and her sibling. So she knew that he wasn't her father. But then when she did do an investigation to find out who is my father, she learned that it was the fertility doctor who was her genetic father. And she has been open about the fact that she is extremely troubled and traumatized to the point where it's very hard for her to speak in public about this. It's very hard for her to be mentally stable overall. And so she really limits her public appearances and the opportunities that she chooses to accept when it comes to speaking about this, because it's so emotionally painful. It's so complex. And she's still dealing with the incredible fallout of not just being separated from a biological parent, but being abused by a purchasing parent. And now you add the additional complexity of knowing that the doctor that inseminated your mother was the one that provided the sperm for all of this abuse to take place.
Yeah, that, I mean, she's using her Instagram and online as sort of that therapeutic, that cathartic ability to share. I think people are finding each other in these. You'll see Reddit threads, you'll see Anonymous Us, the website, people sharing anonymously. And it is really difficult because maybe they're able to find community and there's some people who agree, but I'm sure they get a lot of the pushback of, well, at least you're alive. And, some of the things that we've addressed in other ways on the podcast as well. So your heart just goes out to folks. I mean, especially we don't know necessarily what other kinds of maybe positive community, faith community and support they have. So it's kind of hard that it seems like for some folks, all they have really in way of community is sharing online. So
Mhm.
All right, next story. Tell us about Victoria Hill.
Well, my understanding is Victoria believed that she was the product of her mother and father's sperm and egg, but that she was created through IVF. Not unlike a lot of other donor conceived children, she only realized that was a lie when she took an at home DNA test. And obviously, a lot of these doctors, a lot of these fertility clinics never foresaw the fact that genetic testing would be this widely available, this cheap to so many people. And that has blown apart a lot of the secrecy that I think that they thought they could get away with, you know, 20, 30, especially 40 years ago. So Victoria took that at-home DNA test, realized that her father was not her father, which is enough of a shock to the system. I mean, we already have stories on the Them Before Us website where you find out that information and it plunges these children into an identity crisis. But then, in addition to that, Victoria was messaged by one of her half siblings who disclosed to her that the fertility doctor that she thought was simply helping her mother and father get pregnant was actually her biological father, and that there were multiple half siblings that were living in her area. And then she discovered that her high school boyfriend that she almost married was one of those half siblings. So this highlights what is probably one of the biggest worries outside of not having accurate medical information, outside of wondering who their biological parent is. I think one of the top concerns that children of especially sperm donation have to wrestle with is, am I dating a half sibling? Will my children be dating or accidentally marry a first cousin? Because I didn't know I was conceived through sperm donation. They might not have either. And then you trickle that down generation to generation, and now you have very serious concerns about accidental incest or accidental cousin marriage.
I mean, it's getting to the point where if you, well, I was going to say if you don't have a married mom and dad, you should probably do a genetic test. But then it's like, well, you might have a married mom and dad and still need to do a genetic test if they haven't told you the truth. And it's not a matter of if you're going to get found out. It's really just when, because the 23andMe, people are doing this for fun, just to see, oh, what's kind of my heritage. And, a lot of the family secrets are getting spilled because of this technology. And it's just going to get more and more inexpensive and quick. But yeah, the idea, I mean, we've heard of half siblings who are already married because of, they didn't know they were donor conceived, right? It's pretty crazy. Patience, talk to us a little bit about, there's just something that popped up in Iowa
Mhm.
as well.
Yeah, so there's currently a case in Iowa. There have been a lot of these cases of fertility fraud that have been popping up over the past, decade and a half because at-home DNA testing became so popular. And Dr. Donald Cline, when he was being investigated and was faced with, you know, absolute DNA evidence that he'd been doing this, he said, if I had known that this technology would become available, I wouldn't have done it. And so there's at least 80 doctors who have engaged in fertility fraud. One of them, Dr. John Randall, was the head of the University of Iowa's Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. And so there's actually a case before the Iowa Supreme Court right now, determining whether or not his children and the women who were his patients are able to seek damages against the hospital now, almost 70 years after the fact, because the technology has become available and they've discovered what happened. So that's an ongoing case where the state Supreme Court is going to determine whether or not there's a path forward for justice for these families, because, like every other state at the time, when Dr. Randall was doing this, there wasn't a law making it a criminal offense. And constitutionally, you can't prosecute someone for a crime that was committed before it was considered a crime. So it's a question of whether the hospital would still owe damages, like on a tort level, is my understanding, based on what Dr. Randall had been doing, because he was lying to his patients and he was, you know, doing what he said he wouldn't. And so there's the question of whether or not there's a way for them to get justice, which could be informative in some of these other cases across the nation where there has been so little opportunity for recourse because it wasn't a crime when it was happening.
Can we pause? 80 doctors, 80, 80 doctors that we already know have participated in fertility fraud. And that is pretty significant for an industry that has virtually no requirements around transparency, accountability. And this is what we know just kind of by accidentally stumbling upon it, or the kids stumbling upon it, not because anybody's reporting, not because anybody is making them track and share. I mean, there's supposedly internal controls for how many donors can donate, how many times, with how many clinics in some places. But for the most part, it's anything goes. So we have 80 doctors already. So my suspicion is that is tip of the iceberg material in terms of the kinds of unethical practices that are taking place. And that is purposeful from the top down. That's not even the accidental cases that we're going to get to here. I'm stunned. I was just aware of some high profile cases, but even I, Katy Faust, didn't know that 80 doctors had been a part of this kind of fraud. And obviously the kids are going to live with this, not just for their lifetime, but it's going to impact their children and their children's children. I mean, ultimately we're talking like for some of these sort of gene pool level concerns.
Mhm. Yeah, and I don't know offhand how many fertility clinics there were in the United States in the 80s and 90s when a lot of this was happening. But right now there's somewhere around 500. So, if there had been 500 when this was happening, that's like almost 1 in 6 clinics where a doctor's committing fertility fraud, which is insane. And I'm sure the number of clinics was smaller back then. So just the prevalence of this practice and how widely accepted it was by people within the industry 30, 40 years ago is truly alarming.
Well, and it makes you wonder, okay, so you're a Christian or a conservative listening to this and you're thinking, well, I'm okay with IVF because I'm going to do it the perfectly ethical way. And it's going to be genetic dad, genetic mom, and we're only making as many as we can use and freeze, and we're not grading and all these things. How do you know they're not being graded? How do you know they're not being discarded or donated to research? Because you're told so by an industry that's not regulated, that basically has almost no oversight, depending on the state you're in. And then just things like this. How do you know that the sperm you're going to get is your husband's sperm or your wife's egg or some mixture of it? And we'll get into now, we can kind of transition into the mistakes. This big story that's pretty recent, pretty obvious mistake that it was the wrong baby got put into the wrong mom here. But it's just interesting that even those of us that think we can do it all right, we could do it ethically. At the end of the day, we don't actually have those guarantees. And if they do it wrong, you barely even have legal recourse to go get it fixed. Patience, tell us a little bit about this story about Christina Murray.
Yeah, so Christina Murray was an IVF patient, and shortly after her baby was born, she realized something hadn't gone as planned. Because when the doctor held up the baby was African American, and Christina and her donor were both white. And so her immediate thought was, was it the sperm or was it the embryo? And so shortly after birth, she took a DNA test. She confirmed that the wrong embryo had been used. She informed the clinic. The clinic informed the baby's genetic parents. And then 5 months after she brought this baby home from the hospital, she was required to give up custody of this baby that she had been raising for 5 months and had gestated for 9 months prior to that. And so, she's been public about what happened to her because of this mistake at the clinic. And what's astounding is that hers is not the only story. Daphne and Alexander Cardinal had a similar experience, discovering that their baby wasn't genetically related to them. They had a child naturally. They were struggling with secondary infertility, had another child via IVF. And when they brought the baby home, they're like, she really doesn't look like her sister. And they didn't think about it very much until people started saying, she kind of looks Asian. And again, both of them were white. And so they took a DNA test and it confirmed that there was a 99.9% match that he was not the father, 99.9% match that she was not the mother, and that this was not genetically their child. So they eventually discovered that their embryo had been implanted in another couple's womb. Christina Marie still doesn't know what happened to her embryo that should have been used. But the Cardinals discovered that their embryo had been implanted at about the same time in another couple's womb. And so they had each other's babies. And so when these babies were 4 months old, the couples decided we're going to switch back. so that we each have our genetic child. So, the child's genetic origins were preserved, but at this point, this baby has bonded with these families. And so these 4 month olds go through the experience of just being swapped back, so that the parents have the correct children. And what's wild is that fertility clinics are not federally required to report this kind of mistake. So when this kind of thing happens, they are under no legal obligation from the federal government to inform the patients of what went wrong. And in both of these cases, it was discovered because the parents said, "Hey, this child doesn't look like me and doesn't even look like they're the same race as me, so I think something happened."
What's mind blowing to me about this? Both of these got quite a lot of national attention. Both of them focused on how awful for these parents, the suffering that they have endured. Their own child was raised by somebody else or lost in the system, or they had to give up a child that they were so bonded to, or, oh, this is awful because they did not get their own baby or their own embryo back. But what's amazing to me is this kind of thing takes place on the reg from the perspective of the child. We have entire embryos that are being purchased or quote unquote donated to intended parents. We've got situations where you're intentionally cutting up both the biological and genetic, both the biological mother and father from the child's life to custom make an embryo where the baby's not going to be raised by either of their biological parents. We hear nothing about that because it's what the parents wanted. It's what the adults wanted. It is only when the adults don't get what they want that now it's a national news story. Now it's a scandal. Now we sympathize with one of the parties, and it's always the adult. But when this happens intentionally to the child, it's just called business as usual.
Hmm. Yeah, it's absolutely a case of, we hear about it and we get told to care about it when the adults are harmed. But when everything went as planned and the genetically unrelated child goes home without any access to their family history, then so often it's just like, oh, this was really wonderful. This went exactly how it should.
Yeah, and it's kind of an impossible scenario. The child is going to be permanently damaged either way. So I would say, of course, you want to swap them back so they can have the genetic connection, of course. I mean, like we've talked about, your identity to who am I is tied to whose am I. Okay, this is my mom and dad. But they're going to have that separation anxiety, that disconnect, that inability to attach, maybe, perhaps that would fall in line with a lot of adoptees and people children who lose a parent because they got swapped away from the only people they knew for that 9 months or for that, 15, 16 months or whatever it is. So these technologies are creating these scenarios where adults at the end of the day might have said, oh, okay, well, all's well that ends well. We got our kid back. The child's the one who bears that burden. And then for this woman who had an embryo and got the wrong embryo, and I have a little black baby now. Oh, okay, obviously I'm giving him back to his genetic family. Where's her baby? She doesn't even know. And again, where's your recourse? You lost the human being I had you make for me. What are you supposed to do about that? Are we able to sue that you lost my human being? Well, and like the Alabama thing, the infertility clinic lost the case and they were told, these are children, you are going to be liable for them. And then lawmakers quickly reversed it to make sure we could stay in business because we don't want that billion-dollar industry to be hurt. We don't want to call them children. So the best she can do is like, you lost my luggage. Okay, well, we'll reimburse you for your lost product, right? I mean, that's the scenario that we're in.
Yeah. And Murray has described it as, being an unconsenting surrogate, which, that really is, you know, what happens is it, and it's the same thing that happens in a gestational surrogacy agreement where, yeah, the baby eventually goes home with their genetic parents, in a lot of surrogacy arrangements, but they've still got that bond with birth mom. And that was not insignificant. And, we, like you were saying, Katie, we hear about it when it affects the adults. If Marie had been a willing surrogate, we wouldn't be hearing a news story about this. But because her embryo was lost, And because this was a mistake, then it hits national news and we actually hear about this story.
Yeah. All right. For our final kind of section here, tell us, Patience, just a little bit more about these clinics now and some of the stories that have happened there.
Yeah, so this is an industry that really has been tasked with self-policing, where they're responsible for determining, hey, here are the things that shouldn't happen. Here's how we're going to prevent them. And there really aren't a lot of regulations that are causing follow through. There isn't that accountability to the government in a lot of these cases. And so we've seen mistakes happen. And sometimes mistakes happen because of outright negligence. Other times, there isn't really an explanation for why it happened. But last year, 11 couples sued a fertility clinic for destroying their embryos by accidentally using a toxic solution instead of the one that should have been used for embryo preservation, and then transferring dead embryos without telling the couples what had happened. So some of these couples found out, hey, your embryos were destroyed. Others had the embryo transferred. They thought, this is our embryo's chance at life. This is, we're doing the right thing. And then found out afterwards that the embryo actually wasn't even alive when it was transferred. There have also been several high profile cases of storage unit failures at clinics that have lost thousands of embryos, impacting hundreds of families. So, like I said, there's about 500 fertility clinics in the US. Only a very small number of those are storing embryos in tanks that have actually been approved by the FDA for that purpose. And there's no state law saying that they have to store them in tanks that have been approved by the FDA for that purpose. So when these storage tank failures happen, the families are in a position where they can't even say, hey, you weren't following proper regulations because there was no regulation there in the first place. So these families are faced with the loss of their embryos that happened because of, a power surge, or the tank just failed one day and their embryos that they thought were safe die because of that incident. And Bloomberg Law recently, in an article earlier this month, really highlighted the fact that there's not a lot of recourse for couples when their embryos get destroyed because of clinic mistakes and negligence. There's an ongoing case against Cooper Surgical, the one that used the toxic solution. Um, and it doesn't fit neatly into a medical malpractice case because embryos are outside of the body. They're not recognized as people in most cases. So it's just like this is genetic tissue that's outside of the body. So it's not recognized as medical malpractice in most cases, but also it doesn't fit neatly into destruction of property because um, states have avoided any sort of language that directly explicitly says that embryos are property because they recognize there's something unique happening with embryos. And so they're reluctant, even when there are rulings that strongly indicate that embryos are property and embryos get treated as property under law, exchanged under contract. It doesn't explicitly say that they're property. So then couples are in a spot where they can't really say, well, you caused, damage and destruction of our property when their embryos get destroyed. But the only state that has ruled that this was wrongful death of a child is Alabama. And the pushback against that was so immediate, from both sides of the political aisle saying, oh no, we can't possibly have meant that, that it really puts couples in a spot where they just don't have a path forward when things like this happen. So there are a couple of cases that are currently ongoing where the courts might decide what the legal status of embryos are. But the implications of that are pretty significant. I think it's unlikely that the courts will say that embryos are people. And, as people who recognize the value of life from fertilization, a ruling that says this was destruction of property would be extremely troubling.
I listened to all of this, and of course, I'm horrified. And it's interesting because I think a lot of the response is going to be we need to regulate. Regulate, regulate. We need regulation. And obviously, that would help in terms of some levels of accountability. But at some point, don't you go, maybe we shouldn't make kids in a laboratory? Maybe we should not freeze them in tanks where if there's a power outage and the backup generator doesn't work, you lose 2,000 lives. At some point, I just would wonder if we go, maybe the right way is really just to always personally know and maybe even be married to the person that you're choosing to make babies with. Do it in a way where the environment they're born into is always hospitable for life. Even if the child doesn't make it, even if there is a miscarriage, the child never knew an existence where they were dependent on an AI algorithm to determine whether or not they were fit enough to transfer. They weren't dependent on making sure the temperature of the storage tank was exactly what it needed to be so that they would not fall too deeply into a deep freeze or get to the surface where they thawed out and were destroyed. At some point, I think, need to conclude that maybe if these really are people, we need to treat them as people and dignify them by ensuring that they are created in a way where they will always know their own mother and father. They will not be graded or sex selected or genetically screened out of existence. We won't have to worry about the 1.5 to, I've heard estimates up to as much as 10 million frozen lives on ice in this country. I mean, at some point, should all of these accidental and intentional cases of medical malpractice, shouldn't it at some point make us go, maybe we need to rethink the whole making babies in glass project from the very beginning?
Yeah, that's well said. And I mean, really, that sums up perfectly, Katy, why we do what we do at Them Before Us, why we want so many, as many people as possible to join this movement, to advocate for children's rights in all these different ways. And ultimately, people will be listening to this that struggle with infertility or have made some of these decisions or are considering it. We're trying to use this whole series to say there is more behind this than you will be told when you go to a fertility clinic. And we have other episodes where there is hope for other ways to go about this that is not circumventing infertility and the underlying issues and going and trying to make changes to your body with technology, but to heal and go about it the right way. Or ultimately, that regardless of whether or not we can have children, we can't violate the rights of children. So thank you everyone for listening to the series, this episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Share it with a friend. Give us your comments and feedback at our website, thembeforeus.com. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for joining the Them Before Us movement.